Hi, ocean lovers. Welcome to Season 2, Episode number 4 of Dive Stories, brought to you by PADI, helping millions around the world to seek adventure and save the ocean. I'm your host, Ocean Allison, and on today's episode, I'm chatting with Dr. Asha de Vos, marine biologist and ocean educator. During this episode, Asha shares all about her work studying blue whales in Sri Lanka and beyond, about the differences between scuba diving and deep sea submersible diving, and her fundamental thoughts on the importance of protecting our ocean planet. All that and more coming right up. Thanks for being here. Ready to jumpstart your next underwater adventure? Good news! We're offering Dive Stories podcast listeners an exclusive 20% off all PADI recreational e-learning courses. With PADI e-learning, you can start your next dive adventure right now from the comfort of your own home before connecting at any time with a PADI dive center or resort to complete your in-water training. Head to PADI.com/courses to select which dive course is right for you and use code PODCAST, that's PODCAST, to take advantage of this exclusive 20% off discount. You're listening to Dive Stories. We bring the underwater world to you through in-depth conversations with inspiring divers from around the globe. Thanks for diving in with us as we seek adventure and save the ocean. Happy listening and happy diving. Today's Dive Stories guest is marine biologist and ocean educator, Dr. Asha de Vos. Asha, welcome to Dive Stories, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, definitely. I am super excited to chat with you, but we're actually going to start out by diving right into what we call the Dive 5. And how the Dive 5 works is at the start of each episode, I ask our guest 5 rapid fire questions about their experience as a diver and an ocean lover. So what do you think, Asha? Are you ready to answer the Dive 5?
Yeah, sweaty palms and all. I'm ready.
Okay, perfect. Okay, number 1, where is the first place you ever took a breath underwater?
Sri Lanka.
Okay. Number 2, in one word, how does scuba diving make you feel?
Relaxed.
Nice. Okay, number 3, and I think I probably know the answer to this one, but you never know. What is your favorite ocean animal?
The blue whale.
I knew it. Okay, great. Number 4, who is an ocean hero that inspires you?
Good question. Sylvia Earle and Jacques Cousteau. They have very different styles, but they both brought a lot to the table.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely a great answer. And thank you so much for sharing that, because seeing as you are an ocean hero to so many, really including myself, it's great to hear really 2 of your main ocean heroes. So thanks for sharing that. Okay, last one, number 5. In just one word, what does the ocean mean to you?
Life.
Amazing. Well, thank you for answering the Dive 5, Asha. We're going to get a little more in depth now by jumping into the core of the interview. And I want to start out by chatting with you about, surprise, surprise, whales, right? Which in your work studying whales and educating others about them, instead of just highlighting whales as these beautiful, gentle giants, which, we often hear them referred to as, you actually often refer to whales as ecosystem engineers due to the super important role that they play in the ocean. So I'd love if you could share some of those primary ways that whales really are vital to not just the health of the ocean, but us as humans and just the planet at large.
Yeah, absolutely. And to preface my answer, I'm going to say I do think the whales are charismatic and beautiful, but I think that's not the only reason we should protect them, right? So that's terribly superficial. It's like telling someone they're just good looking but have nothing else to offer the world, which is not the case for anybody on this planet. And whales are ecosystem engineers. Basically, what that means is that just the fact that they're alive allows the ecosystem around them to function more effectively. And they have sort of a more pronounced role to play in the ocean ecosystem than maybe some other species. That's not to say the others aren't important, but whales have this disproportionately large role to play. Well, no pun intended there. But, so fundamentally, if you think about it, right, whales, they're super, super, useful for the environment. They dive to deep waters to feed. Then they feed in these dark places where there's good food, but also like all these amazing nutrients, right? Like iron, nitrogen, phosphorus. And those nutrients aren't really available in the surface of our oceans very easily. So they feed on them at depth and they come up to the surface and then they poop, right? Like whale poop is, it's huge and it spreads over large areas. It's amazing, right? And it's the ocean fertilizer because they're bringing these nutrients from places that have it to places that don't have it, and then kind of like spreading it over the surface. And while most people will look at the ocean surface and think, it's just water, it's not, right? There's all these living creatures, and fundamentally there's loads of phytoplankton, these tiny microscopic plants that basically cover the surface of our oceans. They're really beautiful when you look at them on a microscope, and they're so powerful, those little, they pack a punch, they do a lot, but we sometimes forget that they're there. And so with this fertilizer, what the phytoplankton does, it's the base of every food web. It's a plant, so it uses sunlight and all these ingredients and the nutrients, and it basically photosynthesizes and produces oxygen, right? So a fundamental thing that most people don't realize is, at least every second breath we take is produced by plants in the ocean. And so if you think about it, at least some part of that is fertilized by, whale poop, which is very important for us to remember. Whale poop makes the world go round, right?
Yeah.
And apart from that, whales also, their carcasses, when they die, it's really important because over their lifetimes, their carcasses accumulate carbon, right? And the longer an animal lives, the longer time there is for it to accumulate this excess carbon from the atmosphere. And then what happens is it gets trapped in this carcass. When the animal dies, right, at first on the surface, there's all these creatures that come to have a meal, right? Sharks and seabirds, and you can see them all kind of going for it because it's, whales have a lot of nutrients. They've got the blubber, they've got a lot of good stuff, right? But then over time, the carcass will slowly sink to the depths of our ocean. We call this whale fall. And as it goes down, first of all, it'll land in, some deep, deep, dark place where there are weird creatures that sometimes we don't even know really exist, right? Because they're in places that we might not get to go often. Weird, slimy hagfish or strange worms, creepy crabs, octopus, right? They all make a kind of a feast on this whale fall or what's left of it. And what happens then is also, remember, this carbon that I told you about that's trapped in the carcass then gets taken down to the depths of our oceans, to the deepest points. And that means we're removing excess carbon out of the atmosphere, and which actually is helping us to buffer against the worst impacts of climate change. So these whales are really doing us a huge service. They're helping us to produce more oxygen so that we can all breathe, that every living creature on this planet can survive. They play a role there, but they also play a role in removing excess carbon out of the atmosphere, which obviously we all know is really important as we try to, accelerate to net zero in a very short time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love how you paint the picture of the importance of whales through these, maybe kind of not so lovely ways, right? Their poop and their death, right? But, you say it in such an eloquent way and such a fun and exciting way, as well as impactful, right? Like, clearly whales, through all that you just mentioned, are so important to the ocean, to humans, and the planet. But to give listeners a little bit of context when it comes to this fascinating work that you do in studying whales and teaching others about them, I think it's really important to point out that, incredibly, you are actually the first person from Sri Lanka to ever earn a PhD in marine mammal biology. Essentially, you're Sri Lanka's first whale scientist.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, how did this dream of becoming a marine biologist initially come about for you, since clearly it was a pioneering idea?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I come from an island that has 8 times more ocean area than land area. It's a beautiful tropical island. But honestly, when I was 18, I wanted to be a marine biologist. People thought I was crazy, right? But my dream started much earlier. I was about 6 years old, flipping through, National Geographic magazines, seeing people like Sylvia and Jacques Cousteau, right? And thinking, I want to go where no one else will ever go, and I want to see what no one else will ever see, right? But I mean, what you have to remember is at that time, when I was flipping through those pages, none of those people looked like me, right? And that, I think, is the key thing, is that despite the fact that the people on the pages, people who represented adventure and science, which is kind of what I was dreaming of becoming, an adventurous scientist, despite the fact that it didn't look like me, I still, as a child, I had this self-belief that it was possible and I was going to do this. And I grew up in an enabling environment. My parents just said, do what you love and you'll do it well. I'm really lucky in that sense. Brought up very curious. We didn't have dogs and cats. We had like caterpillars and, scorpions in our bedroom. So science was like all around us, right? And we grew up outdoors, like climbing trees. But, and then I fell in love with water. And as a preteen, one of the things also for me was that I used to swim, and then at my swimming club, I used to meet Sir Arthur C. Clarke, who is a science fiction writer, inventor, futurist, and undersea explorer. And he moved to Sri Lanka to dive the wrecks, and he would tell me all these stories about his dives, right? And I mean, every single story kind of ended a little abruptly for my liking, like I was on the edge of my seat, and I was like, and then what happened? And he'd be like, well, I had to end my dive and come up. And I'm like, what? Like, this is ridiculous. So as a kid, my curiosity was totally piqued. I think it's those influences that slowly kind of penetrated my brain, so that when I was 18, like I said, I knew I wanted to be a marine biologist, but people were so skeptical around me. Sri Lankans are like, great, so what are you going to do with that degree? Like, people didn't know marine biologists. They didn't know what marine biologists did. And jobs related to the ocean were like fishery jobs, right? Like, you're a fisher person. That's the job you could have if you wanted to work with the ocean. And so I think people thought, wow, she's going to go to university and study for years, and then she's going to come back and be a fisherwoman, right? Like that's all they could think about. And people were convinced I wouldn't come home because, like you say, right? Like there wasn't scope for it. That's what they said. They were like, oh, there's no scope to do marine biology. And I was like, this is nuts, right? Like, this is an island, guys. Like, get with the program, But I just pursued it. I had to leave the country. I went to the University of St. Andrews because I couldn't study here, obviously. And I zero regrets. Today there's more people than ever before wanting to do marine sciences. I finished my run just this morning, and I was walking home, and this little girl, I heard this pitter patter, and there's a little girl running behind me, and I turned around and she said, are you Asha de Vos? And I said, yeah. And she says, I'm a fan. And I said, wow, thank you. And she goes, I want to be a sea doctor, right? Like, that is just by pushing through and breaking. I know. I mean, I was so excited. So yeah, breaking the glass ceiling means you're creating space for a lot of other people to dream. And that's kind of my favorite part.
Yeah, you definitely did that. And like you mentioned, you went away to university, you went to Scotland and England and Australia to, very prestigious universities, and got your PhD in marine biology. And like you mentioned, you returned to Sri Lanka, and despite the skepticism that you may have faced before you left, and even when you returned, you have founded the nation's first marine conservation nonprofit called Ocean Swell. And you also discovered a unique non-migratory population of blue whales that lives off the coast of Sri Lanka, which is just all absolutely totally amazing. And one quote of yours that goes along with this topic that I absolutely love is, every coastline needs a local hero. So from your perspective, and you just touched on this story with this little girl a little bit, but to elaborate on that, why was it so important to you to return to Sri Lanka, really kind of forge your own path and fill that position of local ocean hero in your area?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because for me, one thing is, why did I return to Sri Lanka? Because I never really wanted to leave, right? So I come from a family. My dad is very like Sri Lanka proud. He has restored World Heritage sites here, so he's a conservationist of sorts. And I always watched him as a kid, and I really admired his commitment for something much greater than himself, right? In service of our nation. And I think that was kind of like it kind of rubbed off on me. And when at 18, I said I told people I'm going to study and I have to go abroad to study. People just wrote me off as never coming home. But there's two things I said. I said I'd carve my own niche, even though I didn't know what that was. And I said I will return because I want to serve my country, right? And so I had this yearning because I saw Sri Lanka as this place of potential, right? And I still do, with all the chaos that goes on. I still see in the marine sphere that it's such a place of potential. But I also know that the work I do, I can't do on my own, right? It's so ridiculous for any one person to think that we can all tackle, like I can tackle the issues of our ocean. The ocean is 70% of our planet. And I represent a part of the world, the global south or the developing world, whatever you want to call it. That's 70% of the coastlines are in sort of like this part of the world, but we don't have much representation, right? We don't have people at the decision-making tables, on the global, discussions, representing this part of the world as much. And so for me, it became really important to ensure that there was that representation. And to have that representation, I had to chip away and find my way, carve a path for myself so I could be at that table and so I could be heard, so that I could represent the voices of the people who weren't being heard. But then I also was like, we need more people, right? And for me, there's so much joy, right? I would much rather invest and train and, help like 50 other kids than publish 50 scientific papers, right? Like that's how I see it, because that you train one person, they train someone else, and it's just long lasting opportunity and effort, right, to save our planet. So for me, I think we need local heroes. I believe that everyone is a local hero. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to have a degree. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone can make better decisions for our oceans, but they can't unless people like myself, who have the privilege to kind of have spent our careers really trying to understand the oceans, if we're not sharing the information, if we're not giving it away freely, then we can't expect people to come on board.
Yeah, definitely. And so speaking of being a hero, among the very impressive and super long list of awards that you've earned throughout your career, which I'm not going to go through because I think it would take the whole podcast. In 2020, you were named Scuba Diving Magazine's Sea Hero of the Year, which resulted in funding for you to launch a mentorship program for Sri Lankans that are working or studying in marine science and conservation. So why is this mentorship program particularly important to you, especially considering what we just talked about?
It's super important because, when I was starting out, like I said, it was all naysayers. And when I reached out to professors across the globe for support, they were just like, oh, this is an amazing, I just discovered this non-migrated population of blue whales and I wanted to establish a long-term project. And so I wrote off to professors across the world who I thought could help me. And they were just like, basically, get us a research permit so we can come and do the work, right? Like they were trying to take over the project. So everything I've done to date I literally had to figure it out by trial and error. I had no one who could tell me how to do it better. And, I chipped away, stumbled, stood up, dusted off my knees. And it's been a constant process, which I think is a great way to learn, right? Like I'm not afraid of falling and I'm not afraid of failing. But I do think if I had like a mentor, right, I could just kind of tap into sometimes, maybe their experience or their wisdom or their thoughts.
Or just support.
Or just support, absolutely, right? Like just knowing that there was someone there who was looking out for you, like that's kind of a big deal. And so I figured that it's something that I lacked. And so I wanted to give it as a gift to others. And so that's kind of why I wanted to do the mentorship program. And it's remarkable because it allows me more concentrated time. I mean, I do a lot of casual mentorship, but this allows me to do, 6 months of mentoring for a student who an up and coming early career researcher who I think will really benefit. and who can grow. And I just want them to be able to tap into my networks. I want them to just not feel alone, right? And that's kind of a big deal, I think. And especially in the part of the world where it's such a rare field, being able to connect the dots for people is really helpful, I think.
Okay, ocean lovers, it's time for the dive log, the part of the show where we feature an epic dive story from one of our amazing listeners. This episode's listener dive story comes from PADI Master Scuba Diver trainer Brittany Blackburn about some unforgettable diving she's experienced in the Philippines. Let's dive in.
Hi, my name is Brittany, and I'm a dive instructor in the Philippines. And my favorite dive I've ever done is with thresher sharks here near Cebu. I moved here specifically to see threshers. I've dove with sharks all over the world, and they were my favorite. And so I was able to go to Malapascua Island, where threshers are constantly swimming around. And at 5 a.m., you take a boat out to a reef just offshore, and you descend down to about 32 meters. And it was incredible, and they show up, and there were about 3 or 4 of the threshers with their big eyes and their long tails, just the most beautiful creatures, and they're just swimming all around you.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for sharing your thresher shark diving experience with us. I would say that being surrounded by several thresher sharks at one time definitely makes for an unforgettable dive. Listeners, if you have an epic dive story to share too, head to padi.com/podcast to record and submit one of your most memorable dive stories for a chance to be featured in an upcoming episode. We love hearing from our global community of PADI divers, so head to padi.com/podcast today. And now, back to this episode. So, shifting gears here a bit, Asha, when was it that you actually became a certified scuba diver, and what was that initial experience like for you, getting to breathe underwater and, see beneath the surface via scuba diving?
Yeah, wow. I think it was 2001. It feels like so long ago. And, Sri Lanka, diving wasn't as popular as it is today, right? So, the ocean has traditionally been seen as a place of extraction, right? It's fisheries and not really recreation and conservation. So when I was growing up, I had already done my marine biology degree. I was in my 3rd year when I first started to scuba dive, right? So things seem to happen in reverse order. I didn't see my first whale till after my degree, right? So this is how it worked for me. But I couldn't do my because it was the summer holidays from I was in St. Andrews, and it was summer holidays. I was home, but it was the southwest monsoon here in Sri Lanka, so I couldn't really go and do my training here. So I ended up going to the Maldives because by some stroke of luck, my dad had designed a hotel there, and I was able to go out there. And I did this course, right, in these crystal clear waters. And I had this Italian instructor who was wild, right? He was he had so much enthusiasm for this sport, and it was kind of like infectious. And I remember the first time, I had this cumbersome, what felt like cumbersome breathing object on my back. And I'm thinking, God, it seems like a lot of work to remember to just breathe through my mouth. And I have to carry this, the tank on my back. And I have to remember to inflate and deflate and all. It just seemed like a lot. But once I put my head in the water, nothing seemed to matter. Everything happened with ease. And I thought, wow, this is incredible, right? I'm not ducking my head in. I'm able to stay here, to sit, to watch, to witness, and just to marvel. And I think there's just so much magic in that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think many can resonate with that at first. For some that are maybe new to the sport of scuba diving, it's like, what the heck, all this gear, and what am I going to do? And then, getting in the water, and it's like, like you said in the Dive 5, right? Like, it's relaxing for you. I think many feel that way. And anyways, it's cool to hear your first scuba diving experience. But with the name of this podcast being Dive Stories, I ask this to all of our guests. What is one of your most memorable dives, since that first dive till now? What's one of your most memorable dives that you'd like to share with myself and listeners?
Yeah. Wow. That's a fun question. I've done so many dives in a lot of different places, and I would say that the diving in Sri Lanka, right? It may not, we think about the Maldives when we think about diving. There's beautiful reefs and like these beautiful walls that you can dive down, and there's so much color and so much happening. But for me, diving in Sri Lanka is a deeper dive into my own culture, my own heritage, right? In so many ways. And there's one dive site that I particularly love. It's not very far off our coastline, close to my home. It's not special in any way particularly, but every dive I've had there has been remarkable. I think part of the experience is that my best friends are all my dive buddies, right? And we've been diving together for about 15 years. And this is the one particular wreck that always brings us together. And there's a big grouper that hides underneath this wreck, and we call it Big G. And sometimes you're lucky and it'll poke its head out. And to me, those are the most amazing dives, right? Because you're expecting to just traverse this wreck and kind of swim gently across it and watch all, as it's, over the years, as it's been colonized by all this soft coral. And, you've got these fish and you've got these cleaneresses, cleaning up other fish. And there's a lot of life on it. But it is that moment when you see Big G kind of poking its head out. And you remember, like, we're just, just so close to the city, right? This big bustling city where there's just so much chaos, as every city has, and you just can slink off into this ocean with your best friends, right? Have a dive, see an amazing creature that has probably, if it could talk, has these most remarkable stories to share, and we can be back for lunch, which I think is pretty amazing. And so that's one site that I think would be a memorable one. But I have a lot of great dive stories. Dives where you unexpectedly see a whale shark going past, or you have a manta ray swimming through, and or just watching the fish, right? These massive bait balls. I don't know. It's hard to pick one specific one, but I think for me, diving is just really representative of. It's given me a lot more than just these experiences. It's given me best friends. Diving requires a lot of trust, and so these friendships are incredibly deep as a result.
Yeah, no pun intended, right?
Yeah, that's right. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. That's amazing. Now, as a renowned whale scientist, like we've talked about, you're also a Nat Geo explorer. You've gotten to be part of some really amazing projects, even beyond the research that you do. And many of those projects have involved scuba diving, and some of them have even involved going to deeper depths of the ocean using submersibles. Mm-hmm. So as someone that's gotten to explore the ocean in both of these ways, which is pretty extraordinary, I'd love if you could describe actually some of the similarities and differences that you've experienced between scuba diving and submersible diving.
Yeah, wow. That's something that I didn't even know would ever happen in my life. So you can imagine, my shock when I realized the opportunity was opening up for me to get into submersible that could go to 1,000 meters, right? I was pretty happy diving to 30 meters and 35 meters and just kind of like being able to see things, knowing that, there's enough light and there's lots of color and lots of life. But of course, I was always curious about what happened below that. I saw documentaries and heard stories, and I mean, obviously I'm an ocean baby, right? Like, so for me, it was like, but what really does it look like? So, the first question a lot of people asked me when I went on my submersible dive was, were you not afraid, right? And I think for me, I wasn't afraid. I think it helps that I'm not claustrophobic. It's a pretty small dome that you get into, and you have 3 people in it, right? There's not a lot. You can't exactly stand up and go for a walk, right? So you're kind of trapped in this little dome. But it is basically like sitting in your bedroom, and your bedroom is now transported and like sinks gently to the bottom of the ocean. It was remarkable to me. Like, it was crazy, right? Like, so you're with the, two buddies, and you're in there and you're eating your snacks, right? We were eating lunch because these dives are like 8 hours long or whatever. And you kind of take out your lunchbox and you can have lunch, and you're having lunch at like 1,000 meters, right? It makes no sense whatsoever, right? If you think about it, you're like, how is this possible? And it's amazing because, like, having been used to diving in shallower depths and scuba diving, but carrying your whole life support system on your back, and then going into this bubble, which basically was designed to support your life, right? Like, it controls the carbon dioxide and everything. Like, the machinery does all of that, but you are very deep, right? So, like, knowing how to basically getting out of a dodgy situation in both those scenarios is very, very different, obviously. And they both have like very safe procedures if something was to go wrong, and thankfully nothing ever has. But also I was struck by the fact that, I remember the first deep dive, I went to like 300 meters or something in the submersible, and I saw like a barracuda family fish, right? And I was like, this is nuts, right? Like, I've seen them on this, like, in shallow waters, schools of barracuda, and suddenly I'm at this depth, and this animal is basically related to the barracuda. And that, for me, that connectivity was really interesting. And then at 1,000 meters, I saw this like weird crab-like creature, right? And so realizing that they're not that different, in the sense that there are still these amazing creatures that are recognizable, right? So you're not seeing just only like weird blobby, fish and Dumbo octopus type things, but you're seeing things that are recognizably like things that you'd see on the surface, but they're distinctly different, right? Mm-hmm. And the landscape is different, right? So we'll go down to like 1,000 meters and marvel, even if it's all we're seeing is rock, right? But if you're on a scuba dive and you just saw a rock, you'd be like, ooh, wrong dive spot, right? We need to abort this dive and go find the right spot, And that's that mind shift. Suddenly you're like appreciative, because you realize no one else has probably ever been here. And just seeing the sediment and seeing the structure and knowing that there are these tiny creatures that are probably like all over this area, but we just can't see it because they're so small to the eye, is also something like a readjustment of your brain. But yeah, like two totally different experiences. I like the fact that in scuba diving, you come out and you're wet though. And in, submersible diving, you're basically, wearing whatever, shorts and t-shirt and socks. You always have to wear socks because your feet get cold.
Yeah, no, that is an interesting point. In a submersible diving, you're down there for way longer typically, but yeah, you're not actually feeling the water. You're not getting wet. You're not feeling the saltiness and all that. So that is an interesting point I had not thought about. So yeah, and thank you just for sharing those similarities and differences and, your experiences with both. Super interesting. To wrap up though, Asha, as someone that has dedicated most of your life to studying the ocean and advocating for ways that humans can better coexist with the rest of Earth's species, I'm curious from your perspective, whether it's through scuba diving or freediving or snorkeling or a myriad of other things, why is it important that we as humans connect with the underwater world? Getting as many people to see what's going on beneath the surface, how is that going to really help everybody in the long run?
Yeah, fundamentally, I think we can only care for things we know, right? Like, we can't care for things that feel so alien, foreign, and that don't feel like this. I mean, a lot of time people will say, yeah, but how does the ocean affect me, right? How does it matter, right? And that's kind of like, it's quite telling. It's like, one thing is, I think our education systems should be talking more about how the ocean keeps us all alive, right? If nothing else, the oxygen that is generated in the ocean that we breathe all the time. But if people don't get that experience and can't feel that, that salt, that can't taste the saltiness or can't duck their heads in and actually see that, there's this interconnected, wild, bustling life down there that is so fundamentally important to the functioning of our entire planet. I think it's really difficult to get through to people and ask them to care for it, to protect it, if they are constantly afraid of it. Like in Sri Lanka, like in a lot of small island states, you'll find, or small islands, you'll find people don't swim. That is really, that makes our job really much harder, right? Because they have an unhealthy fear. Like in Sri Lanka, if you tell your parents, oh, I'm going to the beach with my friends, like most mothers will say, oh, be careful, don't go in the ocean, right? Like there is this unhealthy fear based on, I don't know what, that's basically passed on from generation to generation. So that fear prevents people from exploring the ocean, which means that if you don't know what's out there, if you don't know how your plastic bag is affecting, if you've never seen a beautiful turtle swimming underwater, then what does it matter if you dump that plastic bag in the water, right? Because it's just a big blue tank of water, and surely there's nothing else, right? And that connectivity is really important if we want to drive change, because people need to see what's out there. Because once they fall in love, that's when we'll start to see change. And actually, I just want to add something, going back to like favorite dives. I have so many, and I did do this one dive in the Dominican Republic with the humpback. This is the first time I've been in the water with a whale. And I will say it was kind of a weird situation, because I was in the water and this whale was swimming past me. And I mean, I wasn't scuba diving. I have to be clear. I was snorkeling. But, it was huge, right? Like it was huge. And I've seen so many whales, but I don't know that I ever thought about like real scale until I found myself next to it. And I was thinking, this giant is like swimming past me. It's crazy. And then I realized that that was actually the calf. And then the mother and the escort were like right under it. And they circled around and they swam past. And I was like, wow, this calf is actually small, right? I think diving also, or being in the water, gives you a lot of perspective about where we are in like, the large ecosystem, and how really small we are, and how unfortunately so small, but we have such a huge negative impact on the planet. And I think getting that perspective allows us to realize that we can afford to do better.
Yeah. Wow. That's so amazing to hear that even you've seen whales for so many years from the surface, and then, they're big and so much about them, but then to actually see one beneath the surface and still be surprised by its size and just the feeling of being, like you said, part of the same system. So it's really amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And Asha, on behalf of our global community of PADI divers and ocean lovers, thank you for your immense passion for studying whales, for inspiring people in your home country of Sri Lanka and really all around the world to better understand and protect our ocean planet. And thank you for joining us on Dive Stories. It's really been so wonderful chatting with you.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me on the show. And thanks to all the listeners who tune in and who care for the ocean enough to make an effort to learn more about it and to learn more about how we can all do better.
Thanks for tuning in to Dive Stories. You've just heard Dr. Asha de Vos, marine biologist and ocean educator. To learn more about Asha and her work, visit oceanswell.org and follow her on social media at Asha de Vos. Inspired to connect with the ocean further? Good news! We're offering Dive Stories podcast listeners an exclusive 20% off all PADI recreational e-learning courses. With PADI e-learning, you can start your next dive adventure right now from the comfort of your own home. E-learning allows you to complete the online portion first and then connect at any time with a PADI dive center or resort to complete your in-water training. Whether you're just starting or continuing your diving journey, PADI e-learning is an ideal way to jumpstart your next underwater adventure. So head to PADI.com/courses to select which course is right for you and use code PODCAST, that's PODCAST, to take advantage of this exclusive 20% off discount. This has been Dive Stories, brought to you by PADI, Seek Adventure, Save the Ocean. If you love the ocean and enjoyed this podcast episode, please subscribe to Dive Stories in your podcast app and feel free to leave a review. Follow PADI on social media and head to PADI.com to join our community of torchbearers working together to seek adventure and save the ocean. I'm your host, Ocean Allison. Happy diving!